Mabel Turner had nothing. Not nothing in the way people say it when they mean they're low on cash. Nothing. No home. No coat. A torn blanket that had stopped keeping anything warm about 2 winters ago. It was December 24th. Christmas Eve. 14 degrees in Cleveland. She was sitting behind the loading dock of a Walgreens on Lexington Avenue. The concrete was so cold it burned through her jeans. She pulled the blanket tighter. It didn't help. It hadn't helped in a long time. Then she heard it. Faint. Coming from the green dumpster about 8 feet to her left. A sound. Weak. Almost nothing. But not nothing. A cry. She stood up. Walked to the dumpster. The lid was heavy. Rusted at the hinges. She pushed it open with both hands and looked inside. A plastic bag. A grocery bag tied loosely at the top. The cry was coming from inside it. She reached in. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the cold, from 14 degrees, and no gloves and fingers that had stopped feeling like fingers about an hour ago. She untied the bag. Inside, a baby, newborn, hours old, maybe less. The umbilical cord still attached, cut rough, tied off with what looked like a shoelace. The skin had gone purple in places. The lips were blue. The cry was barely a cry anymore, more like a sound the body makes when it's trying to stay alive and running out of reasons. The baby was wrapped in a Walmart bag and a hand towel. That was it. That was everything someone had decided this child was worth. Mabel stood there, holding a dying baby in a parking lot on Christmas Eve. 14 degrees. No phone. No money. No way to call anyone. Ray was sitting 20 feet away, against the side wall. He'd been there all night. He saw the whole thing. He said, "Don't." Mabel didn't look at him. He said, "You call 911. You hand it over. You walk away." "That's not your problem, Mabel." She didn't answer. She looked at the baby. She looked at the blanket on the ground. The torn one. The one that didn't keep anything warm anymore. The only thing she owned that still counted as something. She picked it up. She wrapped the baby in it. Carefully. The way you wrap something when you know the wrapping is all you've got. She tucked the edges under. She pulled the baby close to her chest. Now she had nothing. Not the kind of nothing she had 5 minutes ago, which was almost nothing. Actual nothing. No blanket. No barrier between her body and 14 degrees. She had maybe 2 hours before hypothermia became a real problem. She knew this. She was not new to cold. She had one blanket. One. And she gave it away. Ray watched her. He said, "You're going to freeze." She said, "He's smaller than me." That was the whole calculation. Not a speech. Not a moral argument. Not a moment of heroic clarity. He was smaller. He would freeze first. So she gave him what she had. She stood up. The cold hit her immediately. Full body. The kind of cold that doesn't build. It arrives. She held the baby against her chest and started walking toward the streetlight at the end of the block. 3 blocks to Street Augustine's. The church would be open. It was Christmas Eve. Churches stay open on Christmas Eve. Ray watched her go. She didn't look back. She walked. 1 block. 2. The wind came off the street like it had weight. Her arms were shaking. The baby had stopped crying. Not because it was better, because it was too cold to cry. She walked faster. 3 blocks. The light from Street Augustine's was on, yellow through the stained glass. She climbed the steps. She pulled the door open with one hand, the baby pressed against her with the other. Inside it was warm. Not warm like a house. Warm like a building that had heat and walls and a ceiling. Warm enough. Father Dominic was near the altar. 60 years old. Grey beard, rolling up a tablecloth from the midnight service. He looked up and saw a woman standing in the doorway. No coat. Shaking. Holding something wrapped in a torn blanket. He didn't ask what happened. He walked toward her. He looked at the blanket. He saw the baby's face. He said, "Sit down." She sat. He went to the back room, came back with a coat. Not new, not his size. A donated one from the bin. He put it around her shoulders. Then he picked up the phone on the wall near the vestry. He called 911. This was not a choice. This was procedure. A newborn baby abandoned, found in a dumpster. You call. That's what you do. Father Dominic knew this. Mabel knew this too. She didn't argue. She sat in the pew and held the baby and waited. The ambulance came in 11 minutes. 2 paramedics. They took the baby gently, checked vitals, checked temperature. One of them said mild hypothermia. He needs 48 hours at Metro Health. He's going to be okay. Mabel looked at the paramedic. She said, "Can I come?" The paramedic looked at her, looked at the way she was holding the empty blanket. He said, "Are you the mother?" She said, "No, I found him." He paused. He said, "You can ride along." Nobody invited her. Nobody told her she had a right to be there. She just got in. She sat in the back of the ambulance next to the stretcher and watched the paramedic hook up a warming blanket around the baby. The siren was off. They drove through Cleveland on Christmas Eve in the quiet, the streets empty, the lights from houses passing by the window like something from someone else's life. Metro Health. They took the baby inside. Mabel followed. At the desk, a nurse looked up. She said, "Name." "Mabel," said Mabel Turner. The nurse said, "Relationship to the child." Mabel paused. She looked through the glass at the baby under the heat lamp. She said, "I'm the one who was there." The nurse typed something. Mabel sat down. Plastic chair, fluorescent lights. The particular silence of a hospital at 3 a.m. on Christmas morning. She sat there for 3 hours. Nobody brought her coffee. Nobody checked on her. Nobody told her she could go home, because nobody knew she didn't have one. At 6 a.m., the baby was stable. A doctor came out and told her, normal weight, no frostbite. The warming protocol had worked. He was going to be fine. Mabel nodded. She said, "Thank you." Then CPS arrived. 2 of them, a man and a woman. Clipboards, questions, forms. They spoke to Mabel for 20 minutes. She told them everything. The dumpster, the bag, the cold, the blanket. They wrote it down. The woman said, "The baby will be placed in temporary foster care. We'll take it from here." Mabel looked at her. She said, "Can I hold him one more time before you take him?" They looked at each other. The woman said, 5 minutes. They brought the baby to her. She sat in the plastic chair in the hallway of Metro Health and held him. He was warm now, clean, wrapped in a hospital blanket that was white and whole and did what a blanket was supposed to do. She held him close. She said it very quietly, not to anyone, not even really to him, because he was 6 hours old and couldn't understand a word. She said it to the air between them, the way you say things that need to be said, even when nobody's ready to hear them. She said, "You'll be okay." She handed him back. She watched them carry him down the hall. The door closed. She sat in the chair for another 10 minutes. Then she stood up. She walked out of the hospital into Christmas morning, 6:45 a.m., 19 degrees. Still no coat. The donated one was on the pew at Street Augustine's, where she'd left it. She had no idea she had just spoken 3 words that a boy would carry for the next 20 years. She didn't know his name yet. Nobody did. He was case number 2004 CPS 7741. A baby in a system that processed cases, not people. But Mabel Turner was not a case. She was a person, and she had been there. That was all she had. And for now, it was enough. Father Dominic made one phone call. Not to CPS, not to the city, to a woman named Linda Chen, 34 years old, legal aid clinic on West 25th Street. She took cases nobody else wanted because nobody else wanted them. That was the whole business model. Linda met Mabel on a Tuesday afternoon in a room with no windows and a table that wobbled on one side. She had the file open before Mabel sat down. She looked at it. She looked at Mabel. She said, "I'll be honest with you," Mabel said. "Please." Linda said, "No fixed address 6 months ago. No income. No history of childcare. No spouse. No family support on record." She closed the file. She said, "The odds are not close." Mabel didn't flinch. She said, "What do I need?" Linda listed it. Stable housing, steady income, 24 hours of foster parent training, background check, home inspection by a licensed social worker, all of it documented, all of it before the hearing. Mabel said, "How long do I have?" Linda said, "The court date is in 14 weeks. Mabel nodded. She stood up. She said, "Then I better start." She named the baby Elijah, not after anyone. She just liked the name. She said it once out loud in the hospital hallway the morning CPS took him, and it sounded like it fit. She held onto it the way you hold onto something when it's the only part of the situation you get to choose. Week 1. She applied for jobs. 4 places said no. The first was a restaurant on Clark Avenue. The manager looked at the gap in her work history, the 3 years with no address, and said he'd call her back. He didn't. The second was a laundromat. The third was a gas station. The fourth was a grocery store that said they'd already filled the position, but the sign was still in the window when she walked past 2 days later. The fifth was Street Vincent Hospital, night shift, housekeeping, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., $7.25 an hour. The supervisor asked if she could start Monday. She said she could start tonight. Week 3. She found a studio on Euclid Avenue, $425 a month. 1 room, a kitchen that was part of the room, a bathroom with a door that closed. The heat worked. The hot water worked. She stood in the middle of it on the first day and looked at the walls. White, clean enough, small enough that you could touch both walls if you stood in the center and stretched your arms out. She didn't stretch her arms out. She just stood there for a moment. Then she started cleaning. Week 5 through 8. Foster parent training. Every Saturday, 4 hours, 6 consecutive weeks. The class met in the basement of a community center on Lorraine Avenue. Fluorescent lights, folding chairs, a whiteboard that someone had written "Welcome New Foster Families" on in blue marker and then never erased. There were 9 people in the class. Mabel was the only one who came alone. She took notes, not because anyone told her to, because she wanted to remember everything. She filled 2 notebooks. She didn't miss a single session. Not when she was sick in week 6 with something that felt like the flu but she couldn't afford to find out. Not when her shift ran late in week 7 and she had 40 minutes of sleep before the Saturday class. She showed up. She sat in the folding chair. She took notes. Week 10. Home inspection. The social worker's name was Karen Marsh. She was 43. She had been doing this for 11 years and had the particular expression of someone who had learned to see everything and show nothing. She walked through the studio in 4 minutes. It was not a big studio. She looked at the crib, borrowed from Street Augustins. Father Dominic had driven it over in the back of his car. It was used but clean. The mattress was firm. The sheets were new. Mabel had bought them from the dollar store on Payne Avenue. $3.50. Karen Marsh looked at the kitchen. Formula on the counter. Bottles. A package of diapers. She opened the refrigerator. Milk. Bread. Eggs. Peanut butter. Not much, but real food. Bought with real money. She wrote her report in the car. Mabel saw the document 3 weeks later at Linda's office. 1 line stayed with her. Minimal but adequate. She read it twice. She didn't know whether to say thank you or whether to point out that minimal and adequate were not the same thing. She chose silence. Silence had gotten her this far. Week 12. Background check cleared. No criminal record, no history of violence, no substance abuse, no restraining orders, nothing. The system had looked for a reason to say no, and all it had found was poverty. Poverty is not a disqualification, but it's not nothing either. It sits in the room during every hearing. It sits in the file. It doesn't have a line item, but everyone can see it. The hearing was on a Thursday. Courtroom 6A. Judge Robert Williams, 55 years old, 22 years on the bench. He had heard 400 custody cases, maybe more. He had a way of looking at people that said he had already read the file and was now reading the person. The foster family brought Elijah in. He was 6 months old. Mabel hadn't held him since the hospital. She looked at him from across the room. He was bigger. His cheeks were fuller. He was wearing a blue onesie she had never seen before. Someone else had been buying his clothes. Someone else had been feeding him. Someone else had been there at 2 a.m. when he cried. She sat still. She kept her hands on her knees. Linda presented the case. Stable employment 6 months. Stable housing 4 months. Training completed. Background clear. Home inspection passed. All requirements met. The landlord's attorney for CPS reviewed the file. He noted the timeline. 6 months ago, Miss Turner had been homeless. He asked the court to consider the stability of the placement. Judge Williams looked at Mabel. He said, "Miss Turner, why should this court grant custody to a woman who had no fixed address 6 months ago?" Mabel stood up. She didn't look at Linda. She didn't look at her notes. She looked at the judge. She said, "Because I showed up. Every hearing, every class, every time someone told me I couldn't." She paused. She said, "I showed up." The room was quiet. Judge Williams looked at her. He looked at the file. He looked at her again. The way you look at something when you're deciding whether the surface matches what's underneath. He said, "Temporary custody is granted. Review. In 6 months." It was not a victory. It was a reprieve. She treated it like both. They brought Elijah to her in the hallway outside the courtroom. A woman from the foster family handed him over. She said, "He likes to be held on the left side. He sleeps better that way." Mabel took him. She held him on the left side. She didn't cry. She just held him a little tighter than normal. The way you hold something when you've spent 6 months earning the right to hold it at all. She walked out of the courthouse, down the steps, into the parking lot. She didn't have a car. She took the number 22 bus back to Euclid Avenue. She sat in the back with Elijah, on her lap. He fell asleep before they crossed East 55th. She looked at him. She thought about the dumpster. She thought about the blanket. She thought about the social worker, writing minimal but adequate, and how those 2 words had almost become the title of her entire life. Then she looked out the window. Cleveland moved past. Grey sky, bare trees. The bus rattled over a pothole on Euclid. Elijah didn't wake up. She was his mother now, not because the court said so, because she showed up. Elijah was 2. Mabel worked 2 shifts. The day shift at a laundromat on Street Clare that paid cash. The night shift at Street Vincent. She slept in the gap between them. 4 hours, sometimes 5, never 6. She dropped Elijah at the community daycare on East 79th, 6 days a week. Every morning she set him down. Every morning he cried. Every morning she walked out the door without looking back. Not because she didn't want to, because if she turned around, she wouldn't make it out the door. She knew this about herself. She planned around it. Elijah was 5. First day of school. Mabel called in sick for the morning shift. She lost $29. She walked Elijah 11 blocks to Woodland Hills Elementary. He was wearing new shoes, not new from a store, new from a church donation bin, but they fit. That was what mattered. She stood outside the gate and watched the teacher take his hand. She watched them walk inside. The door closed. She stood there for 4 more minutes. No reason. Just stood. Then she turned around and walked to work. 11 blocks back. She was 14 minutes late. Nobody asked why. Elijah was 7. He came home from school and said, "Why don't we have a car?" Mabel was folding laundry on the bed. She said, "We have legs. They work fine." He said, "Billy's mom has a car." She said, "Billy's mom doesn't have you." He looked at her. He didn't ask again. He also knew, even at 7, that it was the best answer she had, and that it was true, and that sometimes the best answer and the true answer are the same thing, and that's enough. Elijah was 8. Parent-teacher conference. The classroom smelled like glue and construction paper. The teacher, a woman named Miss Rodriguez, smiled and said Elijah was doing well, reading above grade level. Quiet, but engaged. Then she said, "Is there anything about Elijah's background we should know?" Mabel looked at her. She said, "He's a good kid who does his homework." That was all she said. She didn't mention the dumpster. She didn't mention Christmas Eve. She didn't mention the blanket, or the hospital, or the 6 months of folding chairs and background checks, and a social worker writing 2 words that almost defined her. Miss Rodriguez never knew any of it. Elijah was 9. He brought home a certificate. Most improved reader. Gold border. His name printed in the center in a font that was trying to look official. He handed it to Mabel like it was a report he wasn't sure about. She looked at it. She put it on the kitchen wall with tape. It fell down the next week. She taped it again. It fell down in March. She taped it again. The 3rd time she used 2 layers of tape. It stayed. It was still there 3 years later, the edges curling the tape yellowed, the gold border fading. She never took it down. She never replaced it with anything else. The blanket was still in the box under the bed, folded, inside a cardboard box that had once held canned goods from the food bank. Mabel never moved it, never washed it, never explained it. Elijah found it once. He was 10, looking for a shoe that had rolled under the bed. He pulled the box out, opened it, looked inside. He said, "What's that?" Mabel was in the kitchen. She said, "Just an old blanket." He looked at it. Torn, thin, the kind of thing you'd throw away without thinking about it. He put it back in the box. He pushed the box under the bed. He didn't ask again. That was the agreement between them. Unspoken. Unwritten. The things in the box under the bed didn't need explaining. They were there because they were there. That was enough. Elijah knew she wasn't his biological mother. He had known for as long as he could remember. Mabel never hid it. She never made it a speech or a lesson or a careful conversation on the couch. She told him the way she told him everything. Straight, simple, without decoration. She said, "I chose you." He was 6 when he asked what that meant. She said, "It means I didn't have to." And I did. He thought about that for a long time. Not that day. Over years. It came back to him at odd moments. In class, on the bus, at night before sleep. The idea that someone had looked at the situation, looked at the odds, looked at what it would cost and chosen to stay anyway. Not because they were obligated, because they decided. He didn't fully understand it yet. He would, but not for a long time. Not until he was sitting in a courtroom 20 years later, reading a file with her name on it, and understanding for the first time the full weight of what choosing someone actually costs. Elijah was 14. He started going to the public library after school, not for homework, for the law section, 3rd floor, back corner, a row of books nobody checked out, spines, uncracked pages still stiff. He read about custody law, foster care statutes, tenant rights, eviction procedures, not because anyone told him to, because he had watched his mother navigate those systems since he was old enough to sit in a waiting room. CPS visits, court hearings, landlord disputes, social workers with clipboards and questions that always felt like tests. He sat at the library table with a legal dictionary open next to him, looking up words he didn't know, writing them in a notebook he kept in his backpack. He didn't tell Mabel about the notebook. She found it once on the kitchen table. She opened it, She saw the words, adjudication, guardian ad litem, termination of parental rights. She closed it. She put it back where she found it. She didn't say anything about it. One evening he was sitting at the table, and she was making rice on the stove. He said, "The system isn't broken." She looked at him. He said, "It works exactly the way it was built to work. That's the problem." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "When did you get so smart?" He said, "I watched you." She turned back to the rice. She didn't say anything else, but she stood a little straighter at the stove. The way you stand when someone has seen something in you that you weren't sure was visible. Elijah was 16. A Tuesday night. The homework was done. The dishes were in the sink. Mabel was washing them. The water was running. The kitchen was small enough that you could hear everything from everywhere, which meant that silence was never really silent. It was just the sound of water and the clink of plates and two people existing in the same small space. He was sitting at the table. He was looking at her. He said, "Why did you keep me?" Mabel's hand stopped moving. The water kept running. She said, "Because someone had to." He said, "That's not an answer." She said, "It's the only one I've got." He looked at her. She turned back to the sink. The water ran. The plates clinked. Neither of them said anything else. The conversation ended the way most important conversations do, not with a conclusion, with a pause that neither person knew how to fill. He would ask again, years later, in a courtroom, and she would give a different answer. But that night, in the kitchen, with the water running, the answer she gave was the one she had, and he accepted it the way you accept something that you know is incomplete, but also know is true. Elijah was 18. Graduation day. Woodland Hills had a small gym with fold-out bleachers and a sound system that buzzed when anyone spoke too close to the microphone. The class was 112 students. Elijah was fourth in his class. Scholarship to Cleveland Marshall College of Law. Full tuition. The letter had come 3 weeks earlier. He'd read it at the kitchen table. He'd read it again. He'd put it on the table and looked at Mabel. She'd picked it up. She'd read it slowly. She'd put it down. She'd said, "I always knew you were smarter than me." He'd said, "That's not true." She'd said, "It's a little true." Graduation. Mabel sat in the last row. She didn't sit in the last row because she was late. She sat there because that's where she always sat. The back. The edge. The place where you can see everything and nobody notices you. She had learned that position a long time ago and had never unlearned it. They called his name, Elijah James Carter. He stood up. He walked to the front. He shook the principal's hand. He took the diploma. He looked out at the bleachers. He couldn't see her. The back row was too far, and the lights were in his eyes. But she could see him. She could see his hands. The same hands she had held in a hospital hallway 20 years ago. The same hands that had been purple from the cold and barely moving and wrapped in a torn blanket that didn't keep anything warm anymore. Those hands were holding a diploma now. She didn't clap loudly. She didn't stand up. She sat in the last row and watched. She thought about the dumpster behind the Walgreens on Lexington Avenue. She thought about 14 degrees. She thought about a grocery bag tied at the top with a baby inside it. She thought those were the same hands. She had no way of knowing that in 2 years she would be standing in front of him again, not in a graduation hall, in a courtroom, and he would not recognize her. Elijah was 20. Mabel was 58. The distance between them was 300 miles, and the kind of silence that grows when neither person knows whose turn it is to call. Elijah was in Columbus. Second year at Ohio State Law. He had transferred from Cleveland Marshall after his first year because a professor named Dr. Henning had seen something in a paper he wrote about tenant rights and made a phone call. Full scholarship. He worked part-time at a legal aid office on High Street. 14 hours a week. He was good at it. He was busy. He called Mabel every 2 weeks. then every 3, then once a month. Not because he didn't care, because 20-year-olds in law school are building something, and the building takes everything, and the people who raised you become the people you call when you remember to call. Mabel understood this. She had raised him to leave. That was the whole point. You don't raise someone to stay in the same small room on Euclid Avenue forever. You raise them to go, and then they go, and then the room is quiet. She said the same thing every time he called. I'm fine. 2 words. He believed her because he needed to, because the alternative was to worry, and worry wouldn't change anything, and he had a contracts exam on Thursday. She was fine until she wasn't. November. Street Vincent called her into the HR office on the 2nd floor. She had worked there for 15 years. Night shift. Housekeeping. She knew every floor, every supply closet, every elevator that stuck between the 3rd and 4th floor. If you pressed the button too fast. She knew which nurses left coffee cups on the windowsills and which ones cleaned up after themselves. She knew the hospital the way you know a place you've been showing up to for 5,475 nights. The HR woman's name was Diane. She had a folder open on the desk. She said, Mabel, the hospital is restructuring its facilities team. Your position has been eliminated as part of the final reduction. Mabel looked at her. She said, Final reduction. Diane said, we appreciate your 15 years of service. You'll receive 2 weeks of severance and information about unemployment benefits. Mabel said, I appreciate having a job. Diane didn't know what to do with that. She slid a folder across the desk. Mabel picked it up. She stood. She walked to her locker on the 1st floor. She opened it. Inside a coffee mug, with a chip on the rim, a photo of Elijah, at 5 years old, on his first day of school, and a spare jacket she kept for the walk home in January. She put them in a box. She closed the locker. She walked out of Street Vincent for the last time at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. 15 years. 1 box. That was the math. She started looking for work the next week. 58 years old. No degree. No certifications. Her entire resume was 1 line, hospital housekeeping, 2009 to 2024. She applied to 7 places, a hotel on Euclid, a school district, 2 office buildings, a nursing home, a restaurant, a cleaning company. 2 called her back for interviews. The hotel manager looked at her age on the application and said they were looking for someone who could handle the physical demands of the role. Mabel said, I cleaned a hospital for 15 years. He said he'd be in touch. He wasn't. The cleaning company offered her a trial shift. She showed up. She worked 4 hours. The supervisor said they'd call. They didn't. 7 applications. 2 interviews. 0 offers. That was December. Then January. Then February. The numbers didn't change. The rent was $425 a month. Same studio on Euclid Avenue. Same 1 room. Same kitchen that was part of the room. She had never been late on rent. Not once in 19 years. Not when Elijah was a baby and formula cost more than she expected. Not when the hot water heater broke and she paid for it herself because the landlord took 3 weeks to respond. Not once. She was late in December. The first time. She paid half. She told the landlord's office she would catch up in January. She didn't. January came and went. February. March. 4 months. $1,847. That included the late fees. $322 in late fees, on top of rent she couldn't pay in the first place. The math of being poor where falling behind costs more than keeping up ever did. The eviction notice came on a Thursday morning, March 14th. She opened the front door, and a man she had never seen before handed her an envelope. She said, "Thank you." He looked at her like nobody had ever thanked him for delivering an eviction notice before. He probably hadn't been. She closed the door. She opened the envelope. She read it. City of Cleveland, V. Mabel Turner, case No. 2024 EV4471. Hearing date April 22. Courtroom 4B. Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. She folded the paper. She set it on the kitchen table. Next to the table on the wall, the most improved reader certificate was still taped up with 2 layers of tape. The edges had curled. The gold border had faded to something closer to yellow. But it was there. It had been there for 11 years. She did not call Elijah. She picked up her phone. She looked at his name in her contacts. She put the phone down. He was 300 miles away. He was in his 2nd year of law school. He was building something. She had spent 20 years making sure he could build something. She was not going to become the thing that pulled it down. This was how Mabel loved. Not by asking, not by telling, by keeping quiet, by saying I'm fine, and meaning I will handle this myself, because that is what I have always done, and I am not going to stop now just because now is harder than before. She sat at the kitchen table, the eviction notice on one side, the certificate on the wall above, the blanket in the box under the bed. She didn't look at any of them for very long. She just sat there, in the quiet, in the apartment she had lived in for 19 years. The apartment where Elijah had taken his first steps, where she had taped a certificate to the wall 3 times, where she had said I chose you and meant it so completely that the words had rearranged everything that came after. $1,847. That was the distance between staying and losing everything, between the apartment and the street, between the box under the bed and no bed at all. April 22nd was 39 days away. She didn't know it yet, but on April 22nd, the judge assigned to courtroom 4B would be a 20-year-old man from Columbus who had recently been appointed to fill a vacancy on the Cuyahoga County bench, the youngest judge in the county, a name she would not recognize on a nameplate, a face she had not seen since he was 18 years old and walking across a stage to collect a diploma with hands she had once warmed inside a torn blanket. April 22nd, courtroom 4B, 39 days. Mabel washed her coffee mug. She set it on the counter. She went to bed. Tomorrow she would look for work again. Tomorrow she would try the nursing home on East 105th one more time. Tomorrow she would do what she had always done. She would show up. April 22nd, Tuesday. The courthouse was on Lakeside Avenue. Grey stone, wide steps, the kind of building that was designed to make you feel small before you walked through the door. Mabel arrived at 8:47 a.m., 13 minutes early. She was wearing a white button-down shirt she had ironed that morning on the kitchen table because she didn't own an ironing board. Black pants, black shoes that were old but polished. She had polished them with a rag and a little cooking oil because she didn't have shoe polish. They looked fine, not new, but cared for, the way everything in her life looked. Not new, but cared for. 3rd floor, courtroom 4B, long hallway, fluorescent lights. The floor was tile, the color of nothing in particular. The smell was cleaning solution and old paper. She knew that smell. She had made that smell for 15 years. She sat in the 2nd row, hands on her knees, purse on the floor beside her feet. She didn't fidget. She didn't look around. She sat the way she always sat, in places where decisions were made about her life. Still, upright, present. The landlord was on the other side. His name was Gerald Novak. He owned 4 buildings on Euclid Avenue. He had a lawyer. The lawyer had a briefcase and a legal pad and the particular calm of someone who knew the numbers were on his side. Mabel did not have a lawyer. She had looked into legal aid. The clinic on West 25th had a 6-week wait. She didn't have 6 weeks. She had 39 days, and then she had today. The clerk called the room to order. She looked at Mabel. She said, "Miss Turner, are you represented by counsel?" Mabel said, "No." The clerk said, You have the right to request a continuance to obtain legal representation. Mabel said, I'm here now. Let's do this. The clerk looked at her for a moment. The way people look at you when they're not sure if what you just said was brave or unwise, and suspect it might be both. All rise. The door behind the bench opened. The judge walked in. Black robe. Young. 20 years old, which made him the youngest judge most people in that room had ever seen. He moved with the careful precision of someone who knew that people were watching and had decided that the best response to being watched was to be exactly as competent as the situation required. No more, no less. He sat down. The nameplate on the bench read Honorable Elijah Carter. Carter, the name from the Foster family. The name on the paperwork before Mabel's adoption was finalized. The name he had kept because by the time the adoption went through, it was already on his school records, his social security card, his entire paper trail. Changing it would have meant changing everything. So he kept it. Mabel had never asked him to change it. She had said, a name is just a name. What matters is who answers to it. Mabel looked up at the bench. She saw a young man in a black robe. She did not see her son. She saw a judge. 20 years is a long time. The baby she had pulled from a dumpster, the boy she had walked to school, the teenager who had asked her why she kept him. That was a different person. That person was connected to this one by paperwork and memory, but not by sight. She had not seen his face since he was 18. 2 years. 2 years and 300 miles. And the kind of distance that isn't just geography. Elijah looked down at the docket. He read the case number. City of Cleveland v. Mabel Turner. Case No. 2024EV4471. He read the name the way he read every name on the docket. Quickly. Professionally. It was the 4th case of 11 that day. He said, "Counsel for the plaintiff, please proceed." The landlord's lawyer stood up. He presented the case. Lease agreement dated March 2005. Monthly rent $425. Payments current through August 2024. Arrears beginning September. 4 months unpaid. Total outstanding $1,847, including fees. Notice served March 14th. No payment received since notice. The numbers were clean. The timeline was clear. The law was on the landlord's side. Elijah said, "Miss Turner, would you like to respond?" Mabel stood up. She didn't have a legal pad. She didn't have notes. She had her hands at her sides, and the truth, which in a courtroom is sometimes enough and sometimes isn't. She said, "I lost my job in November. Street Vincent Hospital. I worked there for 15 years. They cut the housekeeping department. I've been looking for work since December. I haven't found anything yet." She paused. She said, "I'm not asking you to forgive the debt. I owe it. I know I owe it. I'm asking for more time. That's all." Elijah looked at her. A professional look. The look a judge gives a defendant when assessing the weight of what they've said against the weight of the law. Standard. Procedural. Appropriate. But her voice. The way she said, "That's all." Not pleading. Not performing. Not angry. Just flat. Calm. The voice of someone who had been in rooms like this before and had learned that the volume of your voice has no relationship to whether anyone listens. Something moved in him. Not recognition. Not yet. Something older than that. Something that lived below the part of the brain that matches faces and names. A frequency. A rhythm in the way she spoke that his body knew even though his mind didn't. It was like hearing a song you know but can't name. The melody is there. The words are almost there. But the title is gone. He looked at her for 3 seconds longer than procedure required. She looked back. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She stood there with her hands at her sides in her ironed shirt and her oiled shoes, and she waited. He said, "The court will recess for 15 minutes. He stood up. He walked through the door behind the bench. He closed it. He sat down at the desk in the small room behind the courtroom. He looked at the wall. He looked at the window. He looked at the file on his desk. He didn't know why he had called a recess. He had 11 cases today. He didn't usually call recesses for eviction hearings. The facts were clear. The law was clear. There was no legal reason to pause, but he couldn't shake it. The voice, the stillness, the way she had said, that's all like she had been practicing the art of asking for the minimum her entire life. He opened the file again. Mabel Turner, 1847 Euclid Avenue, apartment 4B, age 58, unemployed, under dependence, one word, none. He stopped. He read it again. No dependence. He knew his mother's name was Mabel. He knew she lived in Cleveland. He knew her last name was Turner. But Turner is a common name, and Cleveland is a big city, and he had not spoken to her in almost 2 months, which was the longest gap since he'd left for school, and the guilt of that gap was a small stone he carried in his chest that he had gotten very good at not looking at. He also knew that he was the kind of person who verified before he believed. Law school had done that to him, or maybe he had always been that way. Maybe growing up in a system that decided your life based on paperwork had made him someone who trusted paperwork more than instinct. He picked up the phone on the desk. He called the clerk's office. He said, "I need an adoption file pulled. Elijah James Carter, Cuyahoga County, 2004. The clerk said, "That'll take about 20 minutes. He said, "I'll wait." 20 minutes. He sat in the chair. He looked out the window, the parking lot below, cars, a woman walking to her car with a stroller, a delivery truck backing up, normal things. The ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning in Cleveland. He thought about the woman in the courtroom, sitting there with no lawyer and no notes, and the calm of someone who had long ago accepted that the systems she moved through were not designed with her in mind. The way she had stood up and spoken. No drama, no tears, just the facts, and then that's all. As if asking for more than the minimum would be a violation of some private code she had written for herself a long time ago. He waited. The clock on the wall said 9:14, then 9:22, then 9:31. At 9:34 the phone rang. The file was ready. A clerk brought it in. Manila folder, thin, the kind of folder that contains the entire legal history of a person's first year of life in fewer than 10 pages. He opened it. Adoptive parent Mabel Ann Turner. Date of adoption the 14th of June 2005. Pre-adoption status. Temporary foster custody granted January 2005. CPS intake notes. Original file. The 24th of December 2004. Infant found abandoned in commercial dumpster behind 4412 Lexington Avenue, Cleveland, OH. Retrieved by civilian. Civilian identified as Mabel Turner, no fixed address. Infant transported to Metro Health Medical Center. Condition mild hypothermia, no other injuries. Civilian accompanied infant to hospital. Civilian, not related to infant. Civilian stated she found the infant while seeking shelter and heard crying from the dumpster. No fixed address. He read that line twice. He closed the file. He set it on the desk. He sat very still. He didn't stand up. He didn't cry. He didn't call anyone. He sat in the chair, in the small room behind courtroom 4B, and felt the weight of what he had just read settle onto him. Not gradually, all at once. The way something heavy lands when it's been falling for 20 years and finally hits. The woman in the courtroom. The woman with no lawyer. The woman who owed $1,847 and had said, "That's all I'm asking for," in the calmest voice he had ever heard. That woman had found him in a dumpster on Christmas Eve. She had taken off her only blanket and wrapped him in it. She had carried him 3 blocks in 14-degree weather, with nothing covering her own body. She had sat in a hospital hallway all night. She had fought the system for 6 months. She had worked 2 jobs. She had walked him to school. She had taped a certificate to the wall 3 times. And now she was sitting in his courtroom, waiting for him to decide whether she got to keep her home. He looked at the file on the desk. He looked at the clock. He had been in this room for 22 minutes. 15-minute recess. He was 7 minutes over. He stood up. He picked up the file. He put it in the desk drawer. He straightened his robe. He opened the door. All rise. The courtroom stood. Mabel stood. Her hands were at her sides. She watched the door behind the bench open for the 2nd time that morning. Elijah walked in. Same robe, same bench, same nameplate. But he was not the same person who had left this room 22 minutes ago. He sat down. He looked at the courtroom. He looked at the landlord's attorney. He looked at the clerk. Then he looked at Mabel, not at her file, not at the case number, at her hands, the hands that were resting on the table in front of her. Still, quiet. The same hands that had opened a dumpster lid 20 years ago. The same hands that had unwrapped a plastic bag in 14-degree cold and pulled out a baby that was almost not alive anymore. The same hands that had taken off a blanket and wrapped it around someone else's child when she had nothing else in the world. Those hands were sitting in his courtroom now, folded, waiting for him to decide something. He knew what he had to do. The law was clear. Canon 3E of the Ohio Code of Judicial Conduct. A judge shall disqualify himself in any proceeding in which the judge's impartiality might reasonably be questioned. There was no grey area. There was no interpretation. The woman in front of him was his mother. He could not sit on this case. He said, "The court is recusing itself from this matter due to a conflict of interest. The case will be reassigned to another judge. A continuance of 30 days is granted pending reassignment." The landlord's attorney stood up. He said, "Your Honor, my client has already waited 4 months. A 30-day continuance on top of Elijah said, 30 days, counsel." He didn't explain. He didn't elaborate. He didn't offer a reason beyond the one he had already given. His voice was level, not cold, not warm, the voice of someone who had made a decision and was not interested in discussing it. The attorney sat down. Elijah said, "This court is adjourned." He stood. He didn't leave. He watched the room begin to empty. The landlord stood up, buttoned his jacket, walked out. His attorney followed, briefcase in hand. The clerk gathered her papers. 2 people from the gallery who had been waiting for the next case stood and shuffled toward the hall. Mabel picked up her purse from the floor. She put it over her shoulder. She stood up. She turned toward the aisle. "Elijah," said Miss Turner. She stopped. She turned around. She looked at him the way you look at a judge who has just said your name, carefully, with the particular alertness of someone who has learned that when authority speaks to you directly, it usually means something is about to get worse. He said, "Could you stay for a moment, please?" She looked at him. She didn't say anything. She sat back down. The clerk looked at Elijah. He nodded. She left. The door closed behind her. The courtroom was empty. Just the 2 of them. The fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The sound of the building's ventilation system. The quiet of a room that had been full of people 30 seconds ago and was now holding only 2. Elijah stepped down from the bench. He reached for the zipper at the back of his robe. He pulled it down. He took the robe off. He folded it. Not quickly, carefully, the way you fold something when you need your hands to do something because the rest of you doesn't know what to do yet. He set it on the chair behind the bench. He walked around the bench, down the 2 steps, past the clerk's desk, past the bar. He stopped in front of the table where Mabel was sitting. He was wearing a white shirt and dark slacks underneath the robe. No robe, no bench, no nameplate. Just a 20-year-old man standing in front of a 58-year-old woman in an empty courtroom on a Tuesday morning in Cleveland. He pulled out the chair across from her. He sat down, level, eye to eye, nobody above anybody else. Mabel looked at him. She still didn't know. 20 years. The baby she had held was a newborn. The boy she had raised had left at 18, 2 years ago. But 2 years is a long time when someone changes from 18 to 20. When they go from a kitchen on Euclid Avenue to a law degree in Columbus. When the last time you saw them, they were wearing a graduation gown, and now they're wearing a judge's robe. She didn't recognize him, because the distance between who he was and who he had become was exactly the distance she had spent 20 years building. He said, "Miss Turner, do you know who I am?" She said, "You're the judge." He said. Before that, silence. The fluorescent lights hummed. A door closed somewhere down the hall. The sound of footsteps fading. He reached into the pocket of his shirt. He took out a photograph. Small, printed on regular paper. The edges were soft from years of being handled. One corner was folded. The color had faded the way color fades on cheap prints, the reds going orange, the blues going grey. It was a photo of a woman holding a child. The woman was standing in front of a door. A studio apartment on Euclid Avenue. The child was about 2. The woman was not smiling in the way people smile for cameras. She was smiling in the way people smile when they don't know anyone is watching. He set the photo on the table between them. Mabel looked down. She looked at the photo. She didn't pick it up. She just looked for a long time. The way you look at something when your eyes understand it before your mind does. Her hand came up. Slowly, she touched the edge of the photo with her fingertip. Her hand was shaking, not from weakness, not from age, from the effort of holding something very large, very still, inside herself. She said, "Elijah." She said it like a question. But it wasn't a question. It was a word she hadn't said to anyone in almost 2 years, and saying it now in this room, to this face, cracked something open that she had been keeping closed for a very long time. She didn't cry. She put her hand over her mouth. She stood very still. The kind of still that comes when you're afraid that if you move the thing in front of you will turn out to be something you made up. That if you breathe too hard, the room will rearrange itself back into a courtroom and this will just be a judge again and you will just be a case number. She stood there. He sat there. Neither of them moved. The fluorescent light buzzed. That was the only sound. 2 people in an empty courtroom, 20 years between them, and a photograph on a table. He said, "Why did you keep me?" The same question. The same 4 words. The kitchen table on Euclid Avenue. He was 16. She was washing dishes. The water was running. She had said, "Because someone had to." He had said, "That's not an answer." She had said, "It's the only one I've got." He was asking again. Not from a kitchen, from a courtroom, not at 16, at 20, not as a boy who didn't understand, as a man who was beginning to. Mabel looked at him. She took her hand away from her mouth. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that happens when someone is choosing between the easy answer and the real one, and deciding after 20 years that the real one is the only one that matters anymore. She said, "Because you were real, and I needed something real." He didn't say anything. She didn't explain. There was nothing to explain. The sentence sat between them like the photograph on the table. Small, worn, true. She looked at him. She looked at the shirt he was wearing, the way it fit, the way he sat with his back straight and his hands on the table, the weight of him, the physical fact of a full-grown person who had once fit inside her arms on a plastic chair in a hospital hallway at 3 a.m. She said, "You look like you eat enough now." He laughed. A short one, unexpected, the kind of laugh that arrives before you can decide whether laughing is appropriate. It was. It was exactly appropriate. It was the most appropriate sound either of them had heard all morning. The laugh faded. The room was quiet again, but a different quiet now. Not the quiet of 2 strangers. The quiet of 2 people who have found each other in a place where neither of them expected to be found. He said, "Do you still have it?" She didn't ask what. She knew. The blanket. She said, "It's in a box under my bed. Been there 20 years. He said, You kept it. Not a question, she said. It's the only thing left from that night. Everything else is gone. The church, the hospital. Father Dominic passed 6 years ago. She paused. She said, the apartment. She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The apartment was the reason she was in this courtroom. The apartment she had lived in for 19 years. The apartment where the blanket was. If she lost the apartment, she lost the blanket. Not because it would be thrown away, because it would be in a box on the street instead of a box under a bed. And there is a difference between keeping something safe and just carrying it. He heard what she didn't say. The way you hear the note someone doesn't play in a song they're singing. He said, "You're not losing that apartment." She looked at him. She said, "You can't do that. You're a judge. It's a conflict of interest. You just said so yourself." He said, "I know. That's why I already recused myself. I'm not doing this as a judge." She said, then as what he said, as someone who owes you everything. She looked at him for a long time. The fluorescent light hummed. The building settled the way old buildings do. A creak, a sigh, the weight of concrete and steel, doing what it has always done. She said, "Elijah, I gave you a blanket." He said, "No, you gave me a life." The room was very quiet. The photograph was still on the table between them. The blanket was in a box, 19 blocks away. The eviction notice was on a kitchen table next to a certificate that said, "Most improved reader," taped to the wall with 2 layers of tape. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say that the silence wasn't already saying. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is more than enough. Sometimes that is everything.